In the early evening of August 28, 2003, 83-year-old Eric Hingston was sitting up in bed trying to catch his breath in the small village of Plympton in the southwest of England. Eric's 81-year-old wife, Audrey, fluffed up a pillow behind him to make sure he was as comfortable as possible. She kissed her husband on the cheek, walked across the small upstairs bedroom, and opened up the window. A cool summer breeze blew in, and Eric instantly seemed to relax. For the past 3 years, Eric had been dealing with a series of health issues. He could only walk short distances with the help of 2 canes, he had heart problems, and he had a catheter. But despite these health issues, his wife, Audrey, had worked hard to give Eric as active a life as possible. And for years, together, they had managed to do just that. But recently, Eric had also begun to suffer from severe asthma, and so he struggled to breathe a lot of the time. He had tried different medicines and treatments, but sitting upright in his bed with the window open seemed to be the only thing that brought him any relief. Audrey turned from the window and looked back at her husband on the bed, and she smiled. She could see his breathing had started to slow down, and he had a calm look on his face now. Eric gave a little smile back to his wife, but it was obviously forced. He hated that he was stuck in bed so much of the time lately. It was just not how he'd imagined his life playing out. And a big reason for that was because Eric had spent the early part of his life in peak physical condition, facing dangers that most people couldn't even imagine. When he was a young man, he joined the Royal Air Force, and he had become a highly decorated World War II pilot who flew covert missions into occupied France. After leaving the military, he no longer risked his life on a regular basis, but he still pushed himself to work hard all the time and to accomplish any goals he set for himself. Eric got married to his first wife, they started a family, and he opened and ran a very successful neighborhood butcher shop that was located below the house where he still lived. And so for decades, Eric had been a highly respected war hero, business owner, and beloved member of the community. But now, he just felt like a burden. Eric's second wife, Audrey, sat down in a chair near the bed and took his hand. The two of them had gotten married later in life, when they were in their 60s, after both of their first spouses had passed away. Audrey knew Eric hated the situation he was in now, but she reminded him that they had shared almost 20 wonderful years together, and she wouldn't trade that for anything. Audrey asked Eric if he needed any more help, but he just said he just wanted to know how the butcher shop was doing. Audrey shook her head and sighed. One of Eric's sons now ran the family business, and he ran it well, but Eric just could never quite let the shop go. Audrey told him she was sure everything was just fine, but she told him she would head down to look into the shop just to check in on things. And so she patted Eric's hand, stood up, walked out of the bedroom, and down a flight of old wooden stairs, and stepped outside of the house. The street where Audrey and Eric lived in the suburban village of Plympton had barely changed in decades. The butcher shop was connected to the house, but it had its own entrance, and right next door was a popular old neighborhood pub. Stone houses lined the little neighborhood, and Audrey could see the spires of St. Mary's Church, which dated back to the 1300s, rising up in the distance. Audrey walked just a few feet to the entrance of the butcher shop. A bell rang above the door as she stepped inside, and right away she saw Eric's son, James, standing behind the counter and slicing into a piece of meat for a customer. James waved at Audrey, and she walked over, and the two spoke for a few minutes. Eric's children and Audrey's own children had been adults when the couple first got together, so Audrey hadn't played any part in raising Eric's kids. But she'd always gotten along well with all of them, and she was thankful that James had dedicated himself to keeping the family shop up and running. A few more customers walked in, and so Audrey said she didn't want to get in the way of business, so she said goodbye to James and walked back outside. She smiled at a pair of young men who were heading into the pub next door, and she could see the street starting to come to life as people got off from work and headed out for the evening. Audrey took a breath. She missed the days when she and Eric would duck into the pub for a pint and end up talking to their friends for hours, and she knew Eric missed that too. She walked back to the house and put on a smile. She didn't want Eric to see that she was feeling a bit sad about how their lives had changed since he'd gotten sick. Audrey walked upstairs to the bedroom and checked on her husband. He was still sitting up in bed, feeling the breeze on his face. He told her he felt like his breathing was much better, but he was feeling a bit tired, so he might just go to sleep. He asked Audrey to keep the light on, which she almost always did anyways, in case he needed to get up in the middle of the night. Then Eric gave his wife a kiss and closed his eyes. Audrey told him to sleep well. Then she walked to the bedroom door, but she stopped before she walked out. She could hear loud noises coming from the pub next door. She thought about closing the window to block the noise, but she knew Eric could sleep through loud sounds, and having the window open meant he got fresh air. So she left the window open, glanced back at her husband one more time, who was already falling asleep, and then she walked out of the room. At 3:45 a.m. on the following day, August 29th, so several hours after Eric had gone to sleep, Audrey was back in his bedroom, but this time she just stood there in the doorway, trembling. She looked at the open window and then down at the floor, and she felt confused and scared. She slowly walked across the room, picked up the phone on the bedside table, and took a deep breath. With her hands shaking, she dialed 999, the emergency number in the United Kingdom. Minutes after Audrey's call, police and paramedics sped down the small village street towards Audrey and Eric's house, their sirens waking up people all around the quiet neighborhood. Detective Inspector Tony Carney of the Devon and Cornwall Police parked on the street and followed several paramedics to Audrey and Eric's front door. Carney knocked on the door, and within seconds, Audrey answered. The sight of this small, frail-looking older woman in her bathrobe hit Carney hard. She looked terrified, and when Carney introduced himself to her, he could tell she was confused and struggling to put words together. Carney made sure the paramedics could get inside the house and head upstairs to the bedroom, but Carney stayed at the door with Audrey. Carney's first thought was that this poor woman should not be here while the police searched her house. She should be somewhere else where she felt safe and calm. Carney also knew he was dealing with a crime scene here, and he didn't want Audrey to accidentally touch or move potential evidence. So he asked her if there were any family members she might be able to stay with while the police were inside of her home. Audrey looked up at him and slowly nodded. She said her son was a retired police inspector and he lived not too far away. Carney signaled for another officer to come to the door, and he arranged for him to drive Audrey to her son's house. Once Carney felt sure that Audrey would be looked after, he put on his gloves, stepped inside the home, and walked upstairs to the bedroom. And when he got up there, he felt like he'd stumbled into a TV crime drama or something, because on the floor of the bedroom, he saw all the paramedics gathered around Eric Hingston, who had clearly been dead when they got there. And Eric had been brutally stabbed in his collarbone. On several British TV shows, murders took place in small English villages every week. But in reality, murder cases in places like Plimpton were virtually unheard of. And specifically, the murder of an older man in his 80s like Eric was just really not something that ever happened anywhere near here. Carney glanced around the bedroom. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, and clothes covered most of the wooden floor. He looked over at the open window, and on the windowsill, he saw a black plastic bin liner, the British term for trash bag. He walked over to the window, looked in the bag, and saw several pieces of expensive jewelry inside. And something outside the window also caught his eye. Carney leaned out, and in the glow of a single outdoor light, he saw a metal ladder perched against the house just below the bedroom window. Just then, Carney heard someone calling his name. He leaned back inside from the window, turned, and saw a small team of forensics officers entering the bedroom. Carney asked the paramedics to clear out, and he gave the forensics team a few minutes to search the room without getting in their way. And soon, it was pretty clear that all the investigators and first responders believed the same thing. This had to have been a robbery gone bad. Someone must have climbed up the ladder into the bedroom, stolen some jewelry, and then Eric must have woken up, tried to stop them, so they killed him. But if that was the case, Carney wondered why the thief had left the jewelry behind. Did they just panic? Or did Audrey catch them in the act? The thief killed Eric, but maybe they just couldn't bring themselves to kill a woman who probably looked a lot like their grandmother. The forensics team continued their work in the bedroom, and Carney headed back downstairs and outside. Police officers had cordoned off the house with crime scene tape, and the neighbors had come out of their homes and had started to ask questions. Carney had worked cases in a number of other small villages, and he knew that even residents with the best intentions could end up slowing down an investigation. News about crimes in these small towns, especially a violent crime, spread fast and led to wild rumors and speculation and misinformation. And people would start calling the police, claiming they saw dangerous criminals on every street corner and in every pub. Carney walked back to his car and called into the station. He said he wanted a mobile command unit set up near the house, and he wanted officers on site whose sole purpose would be to answer questions from the community and provide as much transparency as possible. After that, Carney walked away from his car and informed the officers outside that they would have help soon. But before Carney could go back into the house, he saw another uniformed officer leading a middle-aged man towards him. The man looked almost as dazed as Audrey had. The man introduced himself as the victim's son, James, and he said he ran the family butcher shop connected to the house. A friend who lived nearby had called him to tell him what was going on, and James said he had spoken to the uniformed officer, so he already knew his dad was dead. Carney eyed James and then looked over at the shop. He wondered if it was too much of a coincidence that James worked at a butcher shop, presumably with knives, and his father was the murder victim who had been stabbed to death. James told Carney he still needed to call the rest of his family to let them know what had happened. Carney said he understood, however, before he left, he wanted to know if anyone who worked at the butcher shop, or anyone who might have worked there in the past, could possibly have had a grudge against his father. James shook his head and said no. He said police could talk to anyone who had ever worked for his dad, or anyone in the neighborhood for that matter, and they would all say they loved Eric, like family. Carney said how sorry he was again, and then told James he would follow up when he needed to, and then Carney walked back inside the house. Up in the bedroom, Carney found the forensics team combing over every inch of the floor and also bagging jewelry and clothing as potential evidence. One of the officers told Carney that they had pulled blood samples from Eric's body, but they hadn't found that much blood on the floors or the walls. They believed the stab wound had been deep enough to puncture Eric's lung and kill him, but it hadn't actually caused a lot of bleeding. The forensics officer said the puncture spot on Eric's body was deeper than it was wide, which most likely meant the blade was very, very sharp. The officer also said that they still had not found the murder weapon or any usable fingerprints in the room or outside of the window, but they would keep on looking. Carney hoped the team would eventually find usable prints, but he thought he might not even need them, because he believed there was a good chance Audrey had interrupted the robbery and gotten a good look at her husband's killer. On August 30th, so a day after the discovery of Eric's body, Carney and his partner, Neil Treby, knocked on the front door of a small house in a town not far from Plimpton. A man in his mid-50s answered. He told the investigators that he was Audrey's son, and that yes, he was a retired police detective sergeant. Carney and Treby felt lucky their potential main witness's son was a former cop. He could help them explain what was happening in the investigation to his mother, and also maybe make her feel safer and more comfortable when she was speaking to them. Audrey's son led them into the front room of the house, where Audrey was sitting on the couch. Somehow, she looked even smaller and more frail than the day before when Carney had met her. But Audrey smiled and politely asked if the officers wanted a cup of tea or coffee. They thanked her, but they said they were fine for now, and then Audrey's son sat down next to his mother, and the investigators sat in chairs across from them. Carney said how sorry he was for her loss. He knew this must all be frightening and confusing. Audrey nodded, but she said she would not let fear or confusion get in the way of helping the police. And then, without any prompting, she said she had seen the men who killed her husband in the bedroom. Carney leaned in and asked if he'd heard her right. There was more than one killer? Audrey nodded and said there were 2 young men. Treby quickly asked if she knew these men, or if she could at least give a clear description of them. Audrey turned and looked at her son, and he told her she should tell them everything she knew. Audrey turned back to the investigators. She told them she had been sleeping in the guest bedroom, and she said she usually did that because Eric liked to keep the window open and the light on at night, which made it difficult for her to fall asleep. And so the other night, or early in the morning, she had woken up when she heard noise coming from the main bedroom where Eric was sleeping. It sounded like someone was groaning and something banging against the wall. Audrey said she figured it was just Eric trying to fumble for his canes to try to stand up and get out of bed, and so she got up and walked down the hall. And at this point, Audrey sort of trailed off. She seemed like she couldn't go on with her story. The investigators didn't want to push her, but her son gently encouraged her to keep going. And at some point, Audrey did begin talking again. She said when she got to the bedroom, her husband was lying on the floor, bleeding, and there were these two young men standing over him. One was holding a knife, and the other was holding a plastic bag. She screamed, and when she did, they ran for the window, climbed out, and disappeared. However, the one that had been holding the bag dropped the bag on the way out. But Audrey said before they escaped, she did get a good look at them. She said she didn't know their names, but she definitely recognized them from the village, and they were really distinct looking. She said one was kind of short, maybe 5'8", and the other was at least 6'1", and he wore bright white pants and a deerstalker hat, just like the one Sherlock Holmes wore. Carney glanced over at his partner. He didn't say anything, but a killer wearing bright pants and also wearing a Sherlock Holmes-style hat seemed really bizarre, sort of like he was on some fictional TV crime drama. Carney asked Audrey if she wouldn't mind giving a detailed description of these two men to a police sketch artist. He also said that he didn't want to pressure her, but if she was willing to go on TV and speak directly to the public about what these men looked like, it could be helpful. Audrey turned and spoke to her son for a few moments, and then after that, she turned back to the investigators and nodded her head. She agreed to do anything that would help get her justice for her husband and bring some closure for his kids. On September 4th, so 5 days after Eric's murder, Inspectors Carney and Treby stood next to Audrey in a large conference room filled with newspaper and television reporters. Police had already started to circulate the drawings of the suspects around town, but Plimpton was just one of several small villages that surrounded the much larger city of Plymouth, so the investigators believed getting the description out on television was key to reaching more people across the entire area. The investigators also believed if people just saw Audrey telling her tragic story, they might be more willing to help. Carney conveyed the basics of the case to the press, and then he introduced Audrey. She stood there for a second in silence, just staring out at the cameras pointed directly at her. She tried to keep her composure, and she spent a minute looking at some notes she had written down. Finally, in a soft voice, she thanked the community for all the love and support they had shown her and her family in the wake of this tragedy, and then she gave a detailed description of the two men she believed killed her husband. Afterward, Audrey stopped and looked down at the piece of paper shaking in her hands. She swallowed and closed her eyes, trying to fight back tears. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes, looked right into one of the cameras, and said very dramatically that there was no need for these men to have done this to Eric. Even if he had tried to fight them off, he was no threat to these two young men. They could have just pushed him aside and left with whatever they wanted. They didn't have to kill him. This press conference sparked an even bigger outpouring of sympathy for Audrey and the family, but it also led to a level of tension and fear that was totally foreign inside of Plimpton. People were now too scared to go out at night, and shopkeepers considered closing their doors early just in case these two murderous young men were out stalking their next victim. However, within just a few days, Audrey's press conference would prove to have been the right decision. On an afternoon in early September, Carney and Treby were working together in Carney's office when a uniformed police officer opened the door. He told them that two men had come to the station saying they needed to speak to the investigators who were handling the Eric Hingston murder case, because they said they were the men that Audrey had identified as being the killers. Inspectors Carney and Treby rushed through the station, and they found these two young men standing with several officers. And they did look exactly like the two young men Audrey had described. The inspectors felt a huge rush because it was like the solution to their case had just fallen right into their laps. Carney and Treby brought the two young men into an interview room, and Carney asked them flat out if they had come to turn themselves in for Eric's murder. But both young men immediately just shook their heads and said no. The taller of the two men said they'd seen Audrey's press conference, and they immediately knew she was describing them. But they had nothing to do with her husband's murder. Treby said if they knew immediately that they were the men Audrey was talking about, why had they waited several days to come in? The young men looked at each other for a second, and then the tall one kept talking for both of them. He said they were scared. Not only did they match Audrey's description, but they also thought people in the village would decide they were guilty right away no matter what they said because they happened to live in a bail hostel in town. A bail hostel was a place where people who had been charged for crimes but had been released on bail could live if they didn't have a permanent residence of their own. Essentially, a bail hostel allowed law enforcement to know where they could find these people if they needed to until their case went to trial. Carney and Treby exchanged a look. They knew these young men were right. A lot of people in the village would assume they were dangerous criminals and decide they were guilty of murder regardless of the truth. But this didn't change the fact that Audrey had clearly described both of them, so Carney wanted to know how they could explain that, if they were not the men Audrey had seen in Eric's room. The shorter of the two men finally spoke up. He said he didn't mean any disrespect, but the old woman might just be confused. They had seen her that day, but not in her house. Instead, they had seen her when they were walking into a nearby pub. The taller man then quickly joined in and said after going to that pub, they went back to the bail hostel and stayed in all night. And they said the inspectors could speak to the people in charge of the hostel because the hostel had strict curfews and kept track of when people left and came back. Carney and Treby got the details of this bail hostel, then excused themselves and left the interview room. And immediately, Carney called the hostel, and the person who answered was able to confirm that both of those men were at the hostel at the time of Eric's murder. And so any rush of adrenaline the inspectors had felt when these two men came to the station had now quickly disappeared. Now, there was a chance that these young men could have snuck out of the hostel and made their way to Eric and Audrey's without anybody noticing, but that was not the most likely scenario, especially considering that these two men had literally sought out the police. And if Audrey really had seen them at the pub that day, there was a chance that in her shock and confusion, she had just remembered these two guys when she was trying to picture the men who were inside of her house. Carney and Treby returned to the interview room. They let the two young men go, but made it clear they would follow up with the bail hostel, so the men should make sure not to leave the village anytime soon. But once the young men were gone, Carney and Treby admitted that if Audrey had confused these two guys with the actual killers, the investigation basically had nothing to go on. With two potential suspects off their list for the time being, Carney and Treby decided to head back to Eric and Audrey's neighborhood. At the mobile command center the police had set up near the house, the inspector spoke with shop owners, old family friends, and delivery drivers and paperboys who might have seen something while they were on their routes early in the morning when Eric was killed. But nobody seemed to have seen or heard anything unusual. And so with very little to go on, Carney and Treby couldn't help but keep coming back to the idea that their victim ran a butcher shop and he had been stabbed with what forensics officers believed was a very sharp blade, something that would be in a butcher shop. So maybe two men from the shop had broken into the house and killed Eric with a butcher knife. They most likely would have had easy access to the home, working so close. But when they spoke to Eric's son James and the few other people who worked at the shop, all of them appeared to have very strong alibis, so the inspectors could not directly tie any of them to the break-in or to Eric's murder. On September 11th, 2 weeks after the murder, Carney and Treby started to feel like the case was already slipping away from them. Their interactions in the community had not yielded any new evidence. Forensics officers had returned to the house, but still had not found any usable prints, and test results from the blood samples taken from Eric's body and the bedroom floor only matched Eric. And to make things even more bleak for the investigation, several people connected to the bail hostel had now officially corroborated the young men's alibi. So it seemed like the killer in the bright white pants with the Sherlock Holmes hat was really just a product of Audrey's fear and confusion. That day, while Carney and Treby continued to look for anything they might have missed in their case files, they suddenly got a call from a police officer in a nearby town. They put the call on speakerphone, and they could both tell right away that this officer sounded upset. He said he had been dispatched to Audrey's son's house because Audrey had attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. The officer said that paramedics had gotten Audrey to the hospital fast enough to save her life. But he also said he had found a suicide note on site, and the note read, "Please catch the terrible people who ruined my life. I cannot live without Eric." As soon as Carney and Treby hung up, a sense of guilt hit both of them. They knew their investigation had not really been going on that long, but the fact that they still had not found the killers had clearly taken a toll on Audrey. Carney and Treby left the station and headed right to the hospital to check on Audrey in person. When they arrived, they learned that Audrey was okay, however, for now, she just needed to rest and recover on her own. So, the inspectors, instead of speaking to Audrey, spoke briefly with a social worker who had met with Audrey when she was first brought into the hospital. And after this conversation, the inspectors decided they needed to start from scratch. There had to be something inside of Audrey and Eric's house that they and their team had simply missed, and they had to make sure they found it before anything like the suicide attempt happened again. Not long after this hospital visit, Carney and Treby led their investigative team back to Audrey and Eric's house. And this time, they wanted to recreate the robbery and murder as best as they could, hoping this might lead to hidden fingerprints or some new idea about what could have happened. They started by having 2 police officers place the ladder outside against the house, scale it, and then try to climb into the bedroom window. And what they discovered is because of the way the window was designed and where it was situated in the house, it meant that somebody would have to awkwardly stretch up from the ladder, grab onto a small piece of cement, and pull themselves up and over the windowsill and into the bedroom. This proved to be so difficult that even the youngest, most fit cop on the team couldn't do it. And so the only other option for the killers, assuming they were using this ladder, would have been to use the ladder to climb onto the roof of the house and then scale down from the roof and sort of swing themselves into the bedroom. And this scenario, much like the first one, required a lot of strength and to some degree a level of fearlessness because the risk of falling was quite high. And even with all that, it still would have been really hard to pull off. So police wondered if maybe the killers had somehow practiced this maneuver beforehand. After the investigative team tried several more times to run through various ladder scenarios, they headed back inside the house to do another complete search. Now, Carney and Treby had no idea if during this search they would find anything new. The house had already been searched on 3 separate occasions. But they still encouraged their team to literally look everywhere in this house, even in places where it didn't even seem possible that a clue could turn up. And after another lengthy search, when Carney and Treby had both become convinced that they were going to come up short again, they heard an officer shouting their names from the kitchen. Carney and Treby ran through the house. In the kitchen, they saw an officer standing by an open drawer with his back to them. Carney asked what was going on, and the officer said he'd found something that was stuck in the small space between the drawer and the counter the drawer was in. Carney and Treby just stood there with bated breath as this officer jimmied the drawer to try to free what was stuck there. And then finally, the officer got it free, and he turned around, and in a gloved hand, he showed them what was stuck. It was a knife with a red handle and a sharp 7-inch blade. It was the type of knife that would most likely be used by a chef or a butcher. That knife was immediately sent to the crime lab for testing, and when the results from those tests came back, it only confirmed what Carney and Treby already knew. This knife had cracked Eric's murder case. Based on test results from the crime lab, forensic evidence, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Hingston. In the early morning hours of August 29, 2003, the killer dragged a tall metal ladder from Eric and Audrey's back garden to the side of the house. It was dark, except for a couple of house lights on the street, and the neighborhood was completely quiet. The killer placed the ladder against the house beneath the bedroom window, and as they placed it there, the metal of the ladder clanged against the concrete of the house, and the killer froze. They looked around nervously, but there were no signs that the noise they had just made had attracted any attention. So, after that, the killer, instead of walking up the ladder, walked around to the front door of the house and went inside. and they headed up the stairs, holding a sharp 7-inch blade in one hand and a plastic bin liner in the other. Each step they took on the staircase made the house creak, so the killer moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The killer reached the top of the stairs, walked down a short hallway, and entered the bedroom where Eric was sleeping. The light was on, and the killer saw Eric sitting up in his bed. However, he was fast asleep. The killer placed the plastic bag down on the floor, then took a breath, gripped the knife tight, and walked across the room. They stood over the side of the bed, staring down at Eric. Then they raised the knife up and slammed it down into Eric's collarbone. Eric woke up, wheezing and trying to scream. Blood began running down his shirt, and he used all of his strength to pull himself up out of bed, but as soon as he was up, he just collapsed and fell to the floor. The killer just stood there, watching Eric as his breathing got slower and more strained until Eric went still. He had died. The killer then walked to the dresser, opened up the drawers, and began tossing articles of clothing all over the floor. When they had almost emptied the dresser, they stopped, went over and grabbed their bin liner, and then walked over to a jewelry box that was sitting on the bedroom vanity, and they dumped most of the jewelry that was inside of it into the liner. The killer carried the now full bag across the room and placed it on the windowsill. Then they looked outside through the open window to make sure the ladder was still in place, and it was. Satisfied, the killer left the bedroom, went downstairs, but instead of going outside, they went into the kitchen, and they calmly hid the murder weapon in the space between a kitchen drawer and the counter. After that, the killer walked to the front room, sat down on the couch, and waited almost 2 hours before they called the police to report a robbery and a murder that had taken place inside of their own home. "81-year-old Audrey Hingston had murdered her husband." It turned out that Audrey had grown tired of having to take care of Eric full-time. She missed her old life of going out, visiting the pub, and spending time with her friends. Over the years, Eric's health issues had started to make her feel completely trapped, so she came up with a plan to kill him and make it look like a robbery. Audrey went as far as to pick the 2 young men she would pin the murder on. She often saw these 2 young men walking around the neighborhood and visiting the pub, and then she knew they lived in the bail hostel, so she thought they would look guilty. But even after these suspects that Audrey identified came to police and provided strong alibis, Carney and Treby didn't turn their attention to Audrey and think she was guilty. Instead, they truly believed that Audrey had just been confused, and that she really had seen 2 young men robbing her house and killing her husband, just not these 2 young men. However, following Audrey's suicide attempt, the inspectors met with a social worker who'd been speaking to Audrey. And the social worker said it was so strange, but despite what Audrey's notes said about the reason she had attempted suicide was because of her grief over her husband's death, that this social worker's experience with Audrey had been that Audrey had almost no grief or sadness about her husband being dead. And so after hearing this, the inspectors did not immediately believe this 81-year-old woman was a murderer, but they thought she might not be telling them the whole truth about what had happened. And so it was at that point that they tried to recreate the break-in using the ladder outside to get a better idea of what Audrey might have witnessed. But the inspectors quickly discovered that it would have been incredibly difficult, if not downright impossible, to pull off the break-in using the ladder. So when police found the knife hidden in the kitchen, they felt confident that there had not even been a robbery at all, that nobody had used the ladder to break in, and that instead, very likely, someone close to Eric had simply entered his house through the front door and killed him. Now, at this point, the inspectors suspected that either Eric's son, James, or maybe one of the other workers at the butcher shop were the killer. However, the only DNA found on that knife discovered in the kitchen was Audrey's. The inspectors had followed up with James, and when he heard about this knife that was found in the kitchen, he was in complete shock, because he said just a week before the murder, Audrey had come into the butcher shop and asked him to sharpen that specific knife. After Carney and Treby confronted Audrey with all of this evidence, her son, who was the former policeman, was sure his mother had killed Eric, and he convinced her to confess. At the time, Audrey became one of the oldest women in British history to be jailed for murder. But because of the circumstances and her age, She actually only served 7 months in prison. After her release, she was banned from returning to Plimpton or contacting Eric's family for several years. Audrey died in 2016. In the late 1860s, a group of rugged American explorers came out of the wilderness and went straight to a newspaper to tell them about this otherworldly place they had found. And so the newspaper sat down, they got their notepad out, and these explorers start describing this place. And they say, okay, well, it's this huge expanse of wilderness. And in the middle of it, there are all these boiling lakes that are either neon green or yellow or red or all of those. And they're shooting boiling water into the sky. And there are these breathtaking waterfalls and snow-capped mountains. And there are bison and elk and wolves and bears just free roaming the whole area. And so the newspaper, they take all this down, and at the end of it, they say, okay, guys, well, unfortunately, we don't publish fiction. But these explorers weren't lying. They were describing an area that we now know as Yellowstone National Park, which is this massive expanse of wilderness in Wyoming that sits on top of a volcano. And those boiling neon green, red, and yellow lakes really do exist. Those are hot springs, and they are the result of water passing by and making contact with underground magma chambers. Today, Yellowstone is so popular that every year millions of people go to the park, and so as a result, the park employs hundreds of people year-round to keep up with tourism. Many of these employees are young people, like college students, and in addition to being paid for their work, the park also offers them the ability to live in employee housing, which are basically dormitories spaced all across the park to make it easier to just be on site and do their job. And these dormitories are either free or very low cost. And so these young people typically take up that offer and will stay inside of these dormitories for as long as they're working at the park. And so in 2000, a 20-year-old summer employee named Sarah Hulfers, she was staying in one of these dormitories in the park, and she was in her room when a group of other young employees that were staying in this dorm came down the hall and they knocked on her door and they asked her if she wanted to come with them to go swimming. And so Sarah, she had a day off and she wasn't doing anything, and so she said, sure, I'll come with you guys. And so after they all got their bathing suits on and got their towels and snacks packed, they left the dormitories and got into a couple of cars, and then they drove over to this dirt lot that was right up against this huge forest. And so they parked, they got out, and they make their way over to this trailhead that begins in the parking lot and goes straight into this forest. And so they walk down this trail until the trail goes right out of the forest and brings them to the edge of this river. And this river was called the Firehole River. It was called that because the surface of this river steamed, and it gave the impression that this river was on fire. The reason this happened is some of the water flowing through this river would pass by those underground magma chambers, warming it up. And so this is a lot like the hot springs, except on a much smaller level. The hot springs are boiling, whereas this river was just slightly warmer to the point where it would steam. So totally safe to swim in. So Sarah and the rest of this group, they come out of that trailhead and they're standing on the edge of this beautiful river, and they walk down to the edge and they all jump in and they have this great day. They're swimming around, they're playing games, and they were only expecting to be there for a couple of hours, but they were having so much fun that before long, the sun had gone down and they were still in the river. And so when it was dark out, they finally climbed out of the river and they toweled off, and then they realized they had a bit of a problem. Because they did not expect to be there for as long as they were, no one had brought flashlights, and the way back to the parking lot would be going along that trail through the forest, but that was a pretty far trail, and it's totally pitch black out. There's no ambient light, and realistically, there's some pretty big animals that live inside of that forest, and so some people in this group were a little bit nervous about walking through this forest. But ultimately, about half of the group said, you know what, whatever, let's just run through the forest and get back to our cars as fast as we can. I'm sure nothing will happen to us. And the other half decided they would look for an alternative route that would skirt the forest and allow the moonlight to be their guide along the way. That second group was made up of Sarah, along with two 18-year-old boys named Lance Bucci and Tyler Montague. So Sarah and these two boys, they're standing there and they're watching the first group go into the forest and disappear. And then she, along with these two guys, they turn right and they begin skirting the river and walking around the forest. And so they walk downstream with the river on one side and the forest on their left. And they're walking for a while until they see up ahead on their left, it looks like the forest is starting to thin out maybe a little bit. And so they took that as an opportunity to cut left and basically begin kind of going straight towards the parking lot, which was generally off to their left. And so they make that turn, they start walking, and the terrain is relatively open. It's this big open field with a couple of trees here and there. It was pretty easy to navigate, and they felt like, hey, we found a great alternative route. The moonlight's still shining through. We got great visibility. And so they're walking along, happy as can be. And then they see there's a couple of streams up ahead. They get to the first stream, and it's not that big, so they jump across it. They get to the next stream. It's still not that big. They jump across that one. And then they get to this third stream, and they realize, it's still pretty small, but it's significantly bigger than the last two. And so if we mistime it, we could fall into it. Now, this was not some huge deal. They were already wet from having gone swimming, but they didn't want to jump in this stream. And so they considered walking off to the right and trying to find an area that was more narrow they could jump across more easily. But they figured they were probably within maybe 100 or 200 feet of the parking lot. They couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And they really didn't want to go farther and farther away to only have to just jump over this thing anyways. And so they decide, you know what? Let's just jump across it. Let's just do it. If we fall in, we fall in. And so the three of them backed up from the stream to give themselves some running room, and then they grabbed hands, and at the same time, all three of them ran forward and leapt across the stream. And they cleared it. They landed on the other side, but the ground they landed on was kind of loose and soft, and so it kind of crumbled underneath them, and they all fell backwards into the stream. In the darkness, this stream had looked like the other two streams they had seen, albeit a little bit larger, and so they were not thinking this could be potentially hazardous if they fell into the water. But it would turn out this stream was extremely hazardous. It was nothing like the other two streams they had encountered. This one was runoff from a nearby hot spring, and so the temperature inside of this stream was 178 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was practically boiling water, and it looked like it was shallow, but in fact, this stream was 10 feet deep. And so when this trio fell into these scalding waters, they let out blood-curdling screams, and the other group that had ran down the forest path, they had got to the parking lot and were waiting for them, and so they hear this scream, and they just take off running in the direction of the screams. They cut right through the forest, and they come out to that field, and they find Lance and Tyler are on the edge of the stream, desperately trying to pull Sarah out of the water. And so the parking lot crew, they run over, and they grab Sarah, they pull her out. They don't really know what's happened. They don't know this is some boiling stream, but it very quickly dawns on them when Lance and Tyler and Sarah just continue to scream outside of the water that something is horribly wrong. And so one of the people in the parking lot crew, they take off running, they go into one of their cars, and they drive and they get help. And not that long after, a helicopter would arrive and it would take Sarah, Lance, and Tyler to a nearby hospital. It would turn out Lance and Tyler, when they fell into this water, they only submerged up to their necks, and as soon as they hit the water, they immediately turned and got themselves out again. So they were only in the water for maybe a second or two. And these things ultimately saved their lives. Although they did still have burns over almost their entire bodies, they had to go through dozens and dozens of surgeries and years of rehab, and they had to pay all this money for medical bills. So it was not a smooth course after they got pulled out, but they lived. As for Sarah, she was not as lucky. When she fell into the water, she completely submerged. Her head, her body, all of it went under the water, and then she just could not get herself out again, and so she stayed in the water much longer than the guys did. When she was admitted to the hospital, despite the fact she was talking and conscious, the doctors very quickly realized they had a big problem with her. A third-degree burn, or a full-thickness burn, is when the outer layer of skin gets destroyed and also the inner, deeper tissues of the skin also gets destroyed, including the cells that are responsible for reproducing skin. And so if you get a third-degree burn, that part of your body will not heal on its own. You literally have to get a skin graft. And a skin graft is effectively a skin transplant. They will take other sections of skin from your body that are unburned, and they will place them over that site where you have the third-degree burn. But when Sarah was wheeled into the operating room, it was determined that she had third-degree burns on 100% of her body. So there was no unburned skin to use for a skin graft. Her whole body was ruined. And so despite their best efforts, Sarah would pass away 15 hours after arriving at the hospital. A year later, Lance's family would sue the National Park Service for not having put up a sign near that particular stream to warn people of its dangers. But that lawsuit was tossed out because it was determined that the trio, Sarah, Tyler, and Lance, had chosen to walk off trail in a known thermal area, and so they were being negligent, not the park. The next story, which is our number 2 story on today's list, is called Magellan. If you hop in a boat just off the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, and you cruise eastward, after about 7 hours, depending on your speed and the weather, you would come across this massive man-made structure jutting up out of the ocean. It looks like a cross between a construction site and a corporate office building sitting on top of 100-foot-tall metal stilts. It's called Magellan, and it is an offshore oil rig, and it will remain in place until all the oil has been sucked up in that area. The people who work, often for weeks or months at a time, on rigs like Magellan are known as roughnecks, and they have one of, if not the most dangerous job in the world. All exterior surfaces on these offshore rigs are always slick, either with water or oil, and so there is a constant risk of falling, sometimes hundreds of feet. If you're up on a higher platform, you could fall to a lower platform, which could be fatal, or you could fall clean off the rig all the way to the ocean 100 plus feet below. If you add in some bad windy weather, the risk of falling increases tenfold. Also, the crude oil that these roughnecks are drilling for is highly combustible, and so fires are a huge concern as well. And if that wasn't risky enough, there's also this phenomenon known as a blowout, where basically the oil well that the drill is actually drilling into will just explode. Now, all rigs have some sort of mitigating equipment to try to save themselves in case this occurs, but in reality, if it happens and you are unfortunately near the drill when it happens, you are likely to be killed or maimed. While the downsides of working on an oil rig are fairly obvious, the upsides are too. Namely, your pay is fantastic. In 2000, a 41-year-old father of 2 named Gordon Moffat was a roughneck working on the Magellan. His primary job was to perform maintenance on the drill. Now, these offshore rigs work great most of the time, but they do have a habit of breaking down fairly often. And for a drilling company, anytime they are not sucking out crude oil, they're losing money. And so it was just a known thing when you worked on one of these rigs that as soon as there is an issue that causes the drill to stop working, it must be fixed immediately, whether it's day, night, horrible weather, good weather, it didn't matter, it had to be fixed right away. And so on the night of October 9th that year, Gordon had just gotten back to his quarters to end the day when he got a call on his radio that he was actually needed to come back out to fix a problem that had stopped the drill. Now, Gordon was a seasoned roughneck, and he had grown quite accustomed to these late-night calls to go out and fix things, and so he wasn't annoyed. He just put his stuff back on, turned around, and he headed out the door. When Gordon got to the main deck, which is this wide open metal platform right in the middle of the rig where the drill actually passes down through it on its way to the ocean, when he got to the main deck, he was met by some of his co-workers who told him where he would need to go. The cabling that needed fixing was located right below the main deck. However, it was not accessible from the main deck. In order for Gordon to get to it, he would need to go down to the next lowest platform from the main deck. Basically, he would need to hop in an elevator and go down one floor. And from this lower deck, the crew on the main deck would lower down a harness attached to a long wire. They would feed it down through this hole in the main deck platform called a mouse hole. It was about 10 inches across, and they would feed it down, and he would grab the harness, he would put it on, and then he would signal up to the main deck crew, who could literally see him through this mouse hole. They would turn around and they would signal somebody called the hoist operator. And they were located above the main deck, slightly back. They couldn't actually see Gordon, so they're relying on communications with the people on the main deck. And the hoist operator would start their winch. And a winch basically reels in the wire that was connected to the harness that was on Gordon. And so once the hoist operator was informed, he'd turn on the winch, and then Gordon would be raised up until he could access these cables, and then he'd do his maintenance and be lowered back down, and that would be it. Now, Gordon and the crew had done maintenance using this winch system many times before, so this was a very routine fix. So Gordon made his way from the main deck down to the slightly lower deck, and he looked up at the mouse hole and he watched as the main deck crew members lowered the harness with the wire attached to it down through the mouse hole. And so Gordon grabbed the harness, he put it around his waist and he secured it. And after he was sure it was on correctly, he signaled up to the crew on the main deck that he was ready to start, and they in turn turned around. They flagged the hoist operator who started the winch. And so very slowly, Gordon was lifted off the platform he was standing on, and he was brought up after several minutes, all the way up about 10 feet to access these cables. And as soon as he was parallel with them, he waved to the main deck crew, who were not far from him at this point, and he said, "I'm good." And so they turned around, they told the hoist operator, who stopped the winch. And so Gordon got his tools out and he began working on these cables, and the whole time he's trying to stay in one place because the wind is whipping through and he's kind of dangling and swinging around. And then eventually he finishes the repair, the cables are good, and so he signals the crew on the main deck through the mouse hole that he was good to go. "You can lower me back down now." And so the main deck crew, they turn, they wave to the hoist operator to go ahead and lower Gordon, and the hoist operator, he gives the thumbs up and he starts the winch. However, the hoist operator accidentally forgot to switch the direction of the winch. And so when he started it again, instead of the winch spooling the wire out and lowering Gordon, it continued to reel the wire in, pulling Gordon upward. Now, the winch did not move very quickly, and so it wasn't like Gordon is rocketing up towards the mouse hole. However, this problem was immediately recognized by Gordon and the main deck crew, and so they're frustrated. They're yelling up at the hoist operator saying, "Stop, stop, stop, reverse the winch." They're all waving and flagging this guy down. But the hoist operator, after he had hit start on the winch, had just kind of turned around, because this is a routine thing they've done a million times before. And so he's not looking at the crew on the main deck. So he has no idea what's going on. And it was so windy and loud that night on board the rig that he couldn't hear their cries. And so the winch just continued to reel in the wire, slowly raising Gordon closer and closer to the mouse hole. Now, Gordon could not get out of his harness unless he was on the platform below. So there was no way to escape the situation he was in. And so Gordon, after a few seconds of this not stopping and him continuing upward, he starts screaming. He's not annoyed anymore. He's terrified. And so is the crew on the main deck. They are now frantically screaming at the hoist operator to stop the winch, but nothing is working. And so one of the main deck crew members, sensing that they need to do something different to get this guy's attention, he runs away from where the mouse hole is to this nearby phone. And this phone is connected up to the hoist operator station, and he picks it up and it starts dialing. Up in the hoist operator station, he's still not paying attention when the phone rings. He grabs the phone, puts it to his ear, and immediately he's hit with screams to stop the winch. And so the hoist operator, totally confused, whips around and hits stop on the winch. But it was too late. Just a few moments earlier, Gordon had finally been pulled all the way up right to the entrance of the underside of this mouse hole. And as he reached this hole, he tried to position himself in a vertical position so that maybe he could slip his upper body into the hole and he could just kind of slide through the hole. He'd still be hurt by it, but it would limit the damage. However, because of his harness being on his waist right in front of him, he couldn't get himself into a vertical position. He could only lay back in a horizontal one. And so when he reached the underside of the main deck and he's looking right at this mouse hole, he just put his arms and his legs out and tried to push himself back as if he could fight the winch and keep himself from going into this hole. But there was nothing he could do, and so his pelvis first was pulled into the 10-inch hole. And as his body begins to literally break in half, he's screaming out in pain, and then by the time the hoist operator had hit stop, Gordon was already deceased, and only a section of his torso actually made it up through the hole. Gordon's company was found guilty of being blatantly delinquent on many safety protocols, and so they were fined £60,000, and then they paid an undisclosed amount to Gordon's family. The next and final story, which is the top story of today's list, is called Boilermakers. At 7:20 p.m. on Friday, January 12, 2007, 19-year-old college freshman Wade Steffi walked into Ford Dining Hall, which is one of 5 dining halls on Purdue University's campus. Purdue is a prestigious American university located in Indiana that is known for its excellent athletics and academics. Wade, who was an aviation technology student and was at Purdue on a full academic scholarship, grabbed some food and then sat down at a table with some friends. This was the first Friday of the 2007 spring semester, and so Wade and his friends at the table and the hundreds of other students that were sitting all around them were buzzing with excitement about what they were up to that night and what they were up to that weekend. And so Wade and his friends, they sat there chatting about their plans for about an hour, and then at around 8:20 p.m., Wade realized he needed to leave, and so he stood up, he said goodbye to his friends, he carried his tray to the trash can, and then he made his way out of the doors he came in on. And so once he was outside of the dining hall, he immediately turned right and walked the very short distance to the building that was right next to Ford Dining Hall. And so that building was called Owen Hall, and it was a dormitory. Now, this was not Wade's dormitory. He actually lived in a different dorm called Cary Quad West, which was located on the other side of Ford Dining Hall. And so Wade goes inside of Owen Hall because he has some friends in there, and he makes his way to their room, and when he goes inside, he sees they're all kind of sitting around chatting and drinking some alcoholic drinks. And so Wade sits down and he has a couple of drinks and he just hangs out with his friends for about an hour. And so around 9:30 p.m., Wade and the other people he was with in this room, they left Owen Hall and they walked the half mile away from campus to the west to this huge party at a fraternity. And so Wade would stay at this fraternity for several hours until about midnight, at which point he pulled one of his friends aside and he told them that he just remembered he had left his jacket inside of Owen Hall, and so he wanted to go back and retrieve it. The dorms on Purdue's campus all lock at night, and so the only way you can get inside is if you live there and so you have a key, or if you know someone who lives there who will open the door for you. And so during his walk back to Owen Hall, Wade would make 6 phone calls in an attempt to get someone in Owen Hall to open the door for him. But 4 of his phone calls would just be the wrong number, and so the people that were picking up and he was asking to open the door, they didn't know what he was talking about, and so they hung up. But he did call 2 people that did live inside of Owen Hall. However, they didn't answer their phones. And so around 12:30 a.m., Wade arrived at Owen Hall. He put his phone back in his pocket, and he just walked up to the doors, which were locked, and he just started knocking. And eventually, a resident of Owen Hall who didn't know Wade, and Wade didn't know them, they heard the knocking and they came out to the door to see what was going on, and they looked through the glass and they saw Wade, and apparently they decided that Wade looked too intoxicated to let into the building, and so they refused him entry. And so Wade apparently stood there, he kept knocking for a little bit, but he eventually just kind of gave up, he turned around and he walked away. Fast forward a few days to Tuesday, January 16th, and Wade's roommate, who had actually been gone all the past weekend, he returned, and the first thing he noticed when he got back to his dorm was that Wade was not in the dorm. And so he called and texted Wade, but he didn't get a response. And so the roommate went out around the floor that they lived on to ask people if they had seen Wade, and no one had seen him since the previous Friday. And so starting to get pretty concerned, the roommate called Wade's family to see if maybe they knew what was going on with him, but his family had no idea. And so by the end of that day, the police had been contacted about Wade potentially being missing, and they in turn contacted Wade's cell phone provider, and they were able to determine that Wade's cell phone was still showing up somewhere on Purdue's campus, although they couldn't figure out exactly where. So that evening, a massive campus-wide search was launched with hundreds of police officers and volunteers. Even the school's equestrian club came out with their horses to search the nearby woods. But despite this huge search effort that would go on for several weeks, the only thing they would find of Wade's was one of his shoes. It was found on January 20th, so just 4 days into the search, and it was located right outside of an exterior door that led into a maintenance room inside of Owen Hall. But when they searched this maintenance room, Wade wasn't in there. Finally, after nearly a month of searching, when they still had not found Wade, the official search was called off. On March 19th, roughly 2 months after Wade had been reported missing, a maintenance worker was downstairs in the laundry room of Owen Hall when they heard a strange popping sound. At first, the worker thought it was actually coming from one of the washers or dryers that was on, and maybe there's a loose coin or some piece of metal that was inside of the washer or dryer that's getting banged around inside, and that's making the sound. And so this worker began walking around the laundry room, kind of listening in to each of the washers and dryers that were on to see if they were making this sound. And so as he's doing this, he hears the popping sound again, but it's clearly not coming from any of the washers and dryers. In fact, it's not even coming from inside the laundry room. It's coming from somewhere out in the hall. Curious, he leaves the laundry room and he goes out into the hall, and as soon as he's standing in the hall, he hears the popping sound again. And this time, it was obvious that it was coming from behind the closed door that was directly opposite the laundry room. So the worker pulled out his big set of keys, he opened the door that was directly in front of him, and he stepped inside. Moments later, he would make a big discovery. Based on that discovery and the investigation that would follow it, this is a reconstruction of what happened to Wade Steffi. In the early morning hours of January 13th, right after Wade had been denied entry into Owen Hall because the student who was in there who didn't know him thought he was too intoxicated, right after that happened, Wade left the front doors and made his way around to the left side of the building to look for another way inside. And when he got to the left side of the building, he found another door. Now, even though this door did not have a sign on it that said "Keep Out," it was fairly obvious that this door was not designed for students to use. There was a metal railing that lined the outside of this door, clearly to prevent pedestrians from getting to the door, and the door itself was actually not built at ground level. It basically was built at basement level. So you'd be standing at this railing looking down at the door. And down in front of the door was a slab of cement right out in front of it that gave the door enough clearance to be able to open. And so basically there was a railing around a pit, and that was where the door was. The proper way to get to this door was to literally climb over that railing and jump down into this pit. And then you'd need a key to open this door because it was always locked. Well, it was supposed to always be locked. And so when Wade saw this clearly off-limits door on the side of Owen Hall, in his drunken state, he decided it would be a good idea to try to go into it, because in his mind, he thought, whatever is behind the store doesn't really matter. As long as I can just get inside of some part of Owen Hall, I can find my way up to my friend's room and I can get my jacket. And so he rushes over to the railing, he climbs over, he leaps down into that pit area, he grabs the doorknob of this off-limits door and he pulls on it, and it's open. And so he opens it up, he steps inside, and it's totally pitch black. And all he can hear is the sound of machines humming and whirring in the darkness. And again, in his drunken state, he decides this is still a good idea. His only concern was he couldn't find a light switch, and it really was basically pitch black in here. And he was worried once the door shut, not only would his only light source be totally cut off, but it might actually lock behind him and then he'd be trapped inside of this room. And so he took off one of his shoes and he tucked it in the door jamb of the door he came in on to keep it open. And so with the door propped open behind him, he began walking into this room. And pretty much right away, he bumped into this big metal structure. He couldn't see what it was because, again, it was too dark, but he could feel it. And he could tell, it was a flat metal structure. It felt like a machine of some kind. And he could hear that it was one of the machines that was buzzing and whirring. And so he just decided he would try to walk around it. Because again, his goal is just to get through this room and find another door somewhere and kind of continue his journey up into the dorm. And so Wade began moving his way left along this machine, kind of believing it was going to come to a stop at some point, and then he could walk around it. But it would turn out this machine was very big, very wide. And so by the time he actually got to the left edge of this machine, he was practically right up against the wall of the room he was in. And when he got there, he realized the space between the side of the machine and the wall of the room was big enough that if he turned sideways, he could basically squeeze his way past it. Now, he had no idea how far into the room this strange machine went, but in his drunken state, he decided it was a good idea. And so he turned sideways, so his back is to the wall of the room, and his chest is going to be facing the machine, and he begins pushing himself into that narrow space. And so as he's making his way, his hands are up, kind of protecting his face and neck, and at some point, he kind of begins to trip. Now, he didn't actually fall because he's basically wedged into this tight space, but for a second, he reflexively grabbed with his hands onto this machine right in front of him, and just by chance, his left ring finger slipped into a very narrow hole that was about 2 inches deep. The room that Wade was inside of was called an electrical vault, and it contained 6 large transformers, one of which Wade's finger had just stuck inside of. The job of these 6 transformers is to take the high voltage they receive from the main power grid and then transform it, hence the name, into lower usable voltage that gets dispersed into Owen Hall for residents and teachers. Even though the outside of these transformers had mostly been covered with protective materials that mitigated the electrocution risk, there were still several parts of these machines that there was just nothing you could do. They just presented a really high electrocution risk. And one of those sections you needed to be extra careful with was that 2-inch hole that Wade's finger slipped inside of. At the back of that hole was an exposed electrical conductor, and the second the tip of his finger touched that conductor, between 2,000 and 4,000 volts of electricity were pumped into his body. For reference, when people get executed via the electric chair, they are electrocuted with 2,000 volts of electricity. Wade likely died instantly, but because of the fact that he was kind of wedged between the transformer and the wall, after he died, he didn't just slump onto the ground. Instead, he remained in a semi-upright position with his finger still stuck inside of that hole. And so for the next 2 months, his body just continued to be electrocuted every second. Finally, sometime in March, as a result of Wade's body fluids draining out of him, the electrical current that was being pumped into him altered its course and began snapping outside of his skin into the ground. And so the sound of the electrical current actually striking the ground was that popping sound that the maintenance worker heard. The door that the maintenance worker opened in order to investigate the sound was the only other door that led into the electrical vault, the other being the exterior door that Wade had gone in on. Initially, when the worker opened that door and looked inside of the vault, he actually didn't see Wade, but he smelled something funny, and that was what led him to walk into the room and make his way around, and that's when he spotted Wade's body. Earlier, on January 20th, when they found Wade's shoe, which at some point had just slipped out of the door jamb, so it was not propping open the exterior door when it was found, it was just sitting in that pit area and the exterior door was shut. And so when they found that shoe, the police, they did go inside of the electrical vault, but they didn't go in through the exterior door. They went around and went in the same door that the maintenance worker opened from right across the hall from the laundry room. And when they opened it up, they just looked into the room. They didn't walk into the room, they just looked from the doorway, and from their perspective, they couldn't see Wade. And so that was why initially they had said, Wade is not inside of that room. Ultimately, because that exterior door to the electrical vault was supposed to be locked at all times, and clearly it was not because that's how Wade got in, Purdue was found to be negligent, and so they agreed to pay Wade's family $500,000, and they also set up a scholarship in Wade's name.
We kept the sunset in our pockets, golden streaks beneath our skin, running fast through summer doorways, chasing days we couldn't pin. Our laughter caught in shining echoes, skipping like stones across the breeze. We didn't know what love could feel like, but it found us with such ease. And every heartbeat drummed in time with wild horizons.